I'll do a quick session recap before we pick up tonight's game. In the last game, you finally resolved the dispute between the elves and the humans in the forest to the south of where you are now. You managed to do so diplomatically, which honestly impressed me. And then you started traveling. It took about a day and a half to get to the small town you're in. Now, you don't know the name of that town, but as you walked into the town, you were greeted by a pretty big sign at a building centrally located called the Tapped Keg Inn. We're going to pick up from that point, and you walk into this inn. It's alive, it's bustling with life, and it feels pretty nice, honestly, after traveling for almost 2 days. There's a half-orc behind the counter, tending the bar, wearing a stained leather apron, and filling up comedically large tankards full of ale. There's a 2-man band off to the side, and although the music isn't great, after a few drinks, it'll probably sound awesome. In the back corner of the bar, or the bar area, there's a hooded figure. You can't make out any details about them. They're kind of sitting in the shadows, but normally it's best not to interact with those folk. And off to the side, closer to the entrance, actually, there's a halfling sitting at a table, and you see that he has a deck of cards and some dice that he's just rolling and picking up. As you turn around and kind of catch his glance, he looks up at all of you. Do you want to play a game? Welcome to class. I'm Trevor, and I post D&D videos every week on Wednesdays. In this video, I want to talk about running games within games in your D&D sessions, or I guess any tabletop RPG sessions. These game nights, essentially, are a blast, and I've done them a number of times with my players, and they always seem to enjoy it. Personally, I have more of the DM perspective, but I did talk to my wife a lot about this. She's one of my regular players, and she echoed a lot of the same points my other players have made, where they really enjoy these games within games. To paint this a little bit more clearly, what I mean is, or what I always think of, is this scene from The Princess Bride.
Where is the poison? The battle of wits has begun. It ends when you decide and we both drink, and find out who is right and who is dead.
But it's so simple. All I have to do is divine from what I know of you. Are you the sort of man who would put the poison into his own goblet or his enemies?
To be clear, I am not recommending that you poison anyone's drink at your game night. But what I am suggesting is that taking a time to pause the narrative flow to play a game can have a lot of benefits that are maybe unheard of or unseen otherwise, right? You don't notice them unless you're looking for them. First of all, it really enhances verisimilitude. It makes things feel more real when not every single action is leading toward a plot beat. On top of that, playing games within games adds a really great opportunity for all of the players to interact in roleplay primarily, although some games end up being more like combat at the same time. One of the problems that can come up with roleplay is that it's normally 1 or 2 players role-playing with 1 or 2 NPCs, or maybe a group of NPCs, but that's really 1 or 2 players and the DM interacting with one another. When you play a game within a game, then all of the players can be involved. And when I say all, I really mean it. Even if a player at the table doesn't think that their character would play in the game, let's say there's someone who, in the game, who, like, their character is very against gambling. They would never play a card or a dice game. That's fine. That's a pretty interesting character choice. But their character could do something else. They could be sitting at the bar. They could be talking to a barmaid, whatever. And that player could get a character sheet for a different character and still participate in the minigame. And that's why it's so fun, because that benefit actually gives players an opportunity to kind of stretch their role-playing limbs and play other characters in a very, very focused fashion. Because they're not going to be playing full sessions with these other characters. They're just going to be playing these little minigames. Now, I've played a number of minigames in my games, and some of them have been smaller than others. I think the big thing that I'm trying to stress is you don't want to just resolve this with a single die roll. You sit down at the table and the orc deals you a hand. Roll and add your proficiency because you have your gambling set. Yeah, I mean, I guess that it could work that way, but you can run a lot of card games with dice. I've run variations of like blackjack with dice. You can even play liar's dice. I always think of this scene from Pirates of the Caribbean.
I wager everything I own. I only bet on what's dearest to a man's heart. Else there's no way to tell if he's bluffing. What a man is willing to risk, or not to risk, that's a measure of his soul.
I wager 100 years of service.
No. Against your freedom.
Against my father's freedom.
Being able to actually run that in the game makes it feel more real. As a matter of fact, there's a video linked in the description that analyzes that scene, or the full scene. I just pulled a clip. And I think that it does, like that video does a really good job explaining how that moment from Pirates of the Caribbean, which seems like a really kind of random aside, helps to characterize all of the players involved. And the same thing can happen at your table in a D&D game. So, just as some examples, and to be clear, there's a document linked in the description with examples of different games and some of the rules for how to play them. I've started games, like full-on campaigns, in festivals. So there have been festival games going on during these initial sessions. There was like ring toss and pie eating contests and archery and pig wrestling and all of these different things. And my players took up the opportunity to play these different things. Now, this was a lot to juggle because there were so many different little games going on, but my players really enjoyed it and they got to actually do what their character would have done. I also got to add in like fun little souvenirs and things like that for winning these kinds of games. The same thing can be true in a tavern setting. Gambling games come up big here. You can have like axe throwing or darts or dice games, and they can add a sense of flavor and a sense of stakes without it just being back and forth, like dialogue, and without it being like strictly a combat encounter. That said, one additional thing you can add is a bit more complex games. Critical Role, and there's a document in the description as well with games that Matt has run in Critical Role. Critical Role has like kind of not only gambling games like I've talked about before, I think mainly in Campaign 1, but they've also done fighting pits. Now, that might not seem like a game within a game, but as far as I'm concerned, like bare knuckle brawling underneath a tavern is kind of a mini game. And it's because it's not natural combat. It is a mini game that is just, instead of playing with separate set of rules, you're playing with the combat mechanics from 5th edition. And I think that that's awesome. And if a player at the table, if their character wouldn't fight in a fighting pit, give them an NPC. The last point that I'll make in this regard, and this is a bit farther away or more detached than strictly games within games, is using games to enhance other aspects of a D&D encounter or D&D situation. For example, in a very, very cliche, inspired by video game situation, my players beat a boss in one of our previous campaigns, and the boss's lair was falling apart around them, like basically self-destructing. Now, I set up a Jenga tower, and I used the Jenga tower. It was not all of the Jenga bricks, but I used the Jenga tower in addition to skill checks to track my players' progress throughout their escape. Obviously, if you've played Jenga recently, or in general, you know how tense it can be to like finagle those bricks and pull them out. And you can build that tension by just flipping over like a little sand timer, but actually the physicality of like moving these bricks and pulling these pieces really enhances that sense of danger that the players are experiencing, or the characters are experiencing in the game. Now, depending on if and when the tower fell, how the skill checks were going, there are a lot of factors that would affect if the players ended up taking damage or what have you. But the big thing that I'm trying to get across here is that there are like side effects of playing D&D. I know that for my players, like my table, we don't play as many normal board game nights as we used to because we generally spend our free time playing D&D. And that's awesome. I love it. Obviously, I'm making YouTube videos about it, but it means that we don't have that time and we still enjoy those things. So being able to incorporate some of them into a game of D&D is awesome, and it scratches that itch. Now, there are some things like I wouldn't recommend trying to insert terraforming Mars into your game of 5e. That sounds like a nightmare. And if you use any of this stuff, please drop a comment down below. If you've played games within games in your D&D campaigns, let me know. I love new ideas for this, and like I've been saying, my players really enjoy it as well. But, as always, be safe. Make smart life choices.